Have you ever wondered how a simple trip to the supermarket could change an entire community? Picture this: a busy mom, a package of coffee, and an unexpected confrontation that spirals into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. What started as a dispute over the last bag of Blue Ridge roast became the catalyst for a movement that transformed lives, bridged divides, and reminded an entire town of the power of understanding and compassion. From viral video to community revolution, this is the story of how Sarah Thompson and her daughter Julia turned a moment of conflict into a beacon of hope. It's a tale of hidden struggles, unexpected alliances, and the extraordinary impact of ordinary people coming together. Get ready to discover how one cup of coffee brewed a community awakening. You'll never look at your grocery run the same way again. Sarah Thompson sighed as she glanced at her watch, the hands ticking relentlessly towards 3 p.m. Another Thursday afternoon, another trip to Greenwood Supermarket. As a mother of 3 with a tight budget, these weekly shopping excursions had become a delicate balancing act between necessity and frugality. She grabbed her worn leather purse and the recycled shopping bags that hung by the front door. "Kids, I'm heading to the store," she called out, her voice echoing through their modest 2-bedroom apartment. A muffled chorus of "Okay, Mom," filtered back from various corners of the home. The autumn air nipped at Sarah's cheeks as she stepped outside. Leaves crunched underfoot as she made her way down the cracked sidewalk, her mind already racing through the mental checklist of items they needed. Milk, bread, eggs, the usual suspects. And of course, that special brand of coffee her husband Mark swore by. It was one of the few luxuries they allowed themselves, a small comfort in their otherwise frugal lifestyle. As Sarah rounded the corner, the familiar green and white sign of Greenwood Supermarket came into view. The parking lot was busy, filled with a mix of tired-looking parents, elderly couples, and the occasional hurried professional grabbing a quick bite. Sarah felt a twinge of anxiety. Busy days often meant picked-over shelves and longer checkout lines. The automatic doors slid open with a gentle whoosh, releasing a blast of cool air scented with a mix of fresh produce and cleaning products. Sarah grabbed a cart, its wheels squeaking in protest as she navigated through the entrance. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," called out Jerry, the elderly security guard who seemed to be a permanent fixture at the store's entrance. "Hi, Jerry," Sarah replied with a warm smile. "Busy day?" Jerry chuckled, his wrinkled face crinkling with amusement. "Ain't they all? Watch yourself in aisle 5, there's a spill they're cleaning up." Sarah nodded her thanks and headed into the maze of aisles, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew the layout by heart, her eyes scanning for the yellow discount tags that might help stretch her dollars a little further. As she maneuvered through the produce section, carefully selecting apples and checking the firmness of tomatoes, Sarah couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation around her. "Did you hear about the new development they're planning? I swear, these prices go up every week. My Jimmy got into the college he wanted." Each voice told a story, a small glimpse into the lives that intersected in this unremarkable supermarket on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Sarah felt a sense of kinship with these strangers, all of them navigating their own challenges and victories. She paused in the dairy section, deliberating between the store brand milk and the slightly pricier organic option. Her hand hovered for a moment before grabbing the cheaper one. This week's budget was particularly tight, with Emily's school trip coming up. As Sarah made her way through the aisles, her cart gradually filled with the week's necessities. A loaf of whole wheat bread, a carton of eggs, some pasta for quick dinners. Each item carefully considered, each price mentally tallied. The store's PA system crackled to life, a bored-sounding voice announcing a special on canned vegetables in aisle 3. Sarah made a mental note. Every little saving helped. As she approached the coffee aisle, Sarah felt a small surge of anticipation. This was always the highlight of her shopping trip, a moment of indulgence in an otherwise strict routine. The rich aroma of coffee beans filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the rest of the store. Her eyes scanned the shelves, searching for the familiar blue and gold packaging of Mark's favorite brand. There it was, on the top shelf. Sarah reached up, her fingers just brushing the package. And then she froze. There was only one package left. At that exact moment, another hand reached for the same package. Sarah turned, finding herself face to face with an older gentleman, his gray hair neatly combed, his eyes locked on the coveted coffee. For a split second, time seemed to stand still in aisle 5 of Greenwood's supermarket. Sarah Thompson and the gray-haired stranger stood frozen, hands outstretched, either willing to withdraw. In that moment, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, in the most ordinary of places, the stage was set for an extraordinary confrontation. Little did Sarah know that this simple reach for a package of coffee was about to turn her routine shopping trip into something that would change not just her day, but the entire community around her. Sarah's fingers closed around the coffee package at the same moment as the stranger's. For a heartbeat, they both stood there, surprised by the unexpected contact. "Oh, I'm sorry," Sarah said, automatically starting to withdraw her hand. But something made her pause. This wasn't just any coffee. It was Mark's favorite, the one bright spot in his long, grueling days at the construction site. The man, probably in his early 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, didn't let go either. "Pardon me," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "I didn't see you reaching for it." Sarah forced a polite smile. "No worries. It's just, well, it's the last one, isn't it?" The man nodded, his grip on the package tightening ever so slightly. "Indeed it is. I don't suppose you'd consider another brand? I've been buying this one for years." A flicker of annoyance passed through Sarah. Who was this man to suggest she change her choice? "Actually," she said, trying to keep her voice level, "my husband really loves this specific brand. I was hoping to surprise him with it." The man's eyebrows furrowed. "I see. Well, I'm sure he'd understand if you brought home something else just this once. There are plenty of other good brands." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. "With all due respect, sir, I reached for it first." "Did you now?" the man replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. "I'm fairly certain I had my hand on it before you did." Their voices, though still relatively low, had taken on an edge that was drawing attention. A young woman with a toddler in her cart slowed as she passed by, curiosity written on her face. "Look," Sarah said, frustration creeping into her tone, "I don't want to argue, but this coffee means a lot to my family. It's one of the few luxuries we can afford." The man's expression softened for a moment, then hardened again. "And you think it doesn't mean anything to me?" "Mrs. Thompson." "Sarah Thompson." "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Robert Clark. I've been buying this coffee every week for the past 30 years. It was my late wife's favorite. His voice cracked slightly. "I brew a pot every Sunday morning, just like she used to." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overwhelmed by her own determination. "Mr. Clark, I'm very sorry for your loss, truly. But this coffee, it's more than just a drink for us. It's..." She struggled to find the words, "it's hope in a cup. My husband works so hard, and this is one of the few things that brings a smile to his face every morning." By now, a small crowd had gathered at the end of the aisle, watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Sarah could hear whispers, could feel the weight of stares on her back, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Robert's jaw clenched. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your situation, but I'm not going to back down. This coffee is important to me, and I was here first." "You were not!" Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising. "I had my hand on it first, and I'm not leaving without it. Is there a problem here?" Sarah and Robert turned to see a young man in a green Greenwood supermarket vest approaching, a nervous smile on his face. "Tim," Robert nodded at the employee. "Perhaps you can help us resolve this. This young lady and I seem to have reached for the last package of Blue Ridge roast at the same time. I've been shopping here for years. You know I always buy this brand." Sarah felt a flash of indignation. Was he trying to use his familiarity with the staff to his advantage? "That may be true," she interjected before Tim could respond, "but that doesn't give Mr. Clark any more right to it than me. I'm a regular customer too, and I reached for it first. Tim's eyes darted between Sarah and Robert, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot. I'm not sure I can really say who got to it first. Oh, come on, Robert said, exasperation clear in his voice. Surely the store can't condone customers snatching items out of the hands of elderly patrons? Snatching? Sarah sputtered, her face flushing with anger. I did no such thing. How dare you try to paint me as some kind of bully? The crowd at the end of the aisle had grown, with several people now openly watching the confrontation. Sarah could see phones being pulled out, no doubt recording the scene. Please, Tim said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture, let's try to calm down. I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone. The solution is simple, Robert said firmly. I've been buying this coffee here for decades. I think that earns me some consideration. Sarah felt tears of frustration pricking at her eyes. And what about me? Don't my needs matter? This isn't just about coffee, it's about... She trailed off, suddenly aware of how many people were watching. A middle-aged woman in the crowd spoke up. Why don't you just split it? Half and half? It's a vacuum-sealed package, Robert replied tersely. Once it's opened, the coffee won't stay fresh. The situation was spiraling, and Sarah knew it. Part of her wanted to just let go, to walk away from this ridiculous argument over a package of coffee. But a larger part, the part that remembered Mark's tired smile when he took his first sip each morning, refused to back down. Mr. Clark, she said, her voice shaking slightly, I understand this coffee has sentimental value for you. But for my family, it's not about the past. It's about the present, about making it through each day. Can't you understand that? Robert's grip on the package tightened, his knuckles turning white. Mrs. Thompson, Before he could finish, a new voice cut through the tension. Mom? Sarah turned, her heart sinking as she saw her daughter Julia standing at the end of the aisle, confusion and embarrassment written across her teenage face. In that moment, as her personal struggle became painfully public, Sarah realized this simple trip to the supermarket had turned into something she could never have anticipated. And it was far from over. Julia's appearance sent a jolt through Sarah. The teenager's eyes darted between her mother and Robert, then to the growing crowd of onlookers. Mom, what's going on? She asked, her voice a mix of confusion and growing alarm. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. This wasn't how she wanted her daughter to see her, locked in a petty argument over a package of coffee, the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Julia, honey, Sarah started, her voice strained, it's just a misunderstanding. Why don't you go wait by the checkout? Misunderstanding. Robert interjected, his voice rising. Young lady, your mother here is trying to deprive an old man of his simple comforts. Julia's eyes widened, and Sarah felt a surge of protective anger. That is not true, she snapped, turning back to Robert. Stop trying to make me look like the villain here. Their raised voices drew even more attention. An elderly woman sked disapprovingly. In my day, we had respect for our elders, she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Yeah, well, in my day, we don't let people walk all over us just because they're older, a young man in a business suit countered, his eyes never leaving his phone as he recorded the scene. The crowd was growing restless, taking sides in the dispute. Sarah could hear snippets of conversation, judgments being passed left and right. Can you believe how they're acting over coffee? That poor old man. Someone should stand up for that mother. Julia pushed her way through the crowd, her face a mask of mortification. Mom, please, she pleaded in a hushed tone, everyone staring. Can't we just go? But before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through the commotion. What seems to be the problem here? The crowd parted to reveal Mr. Jameson, the store manager, his face set in a grim expression. Sarah's heart sank. This was quickly becoming a worst-case scenario. Mr. Jameson, Robert began, a note of relief in his voice, I'm glad you're here. This woman, Sarah interrupted hotly, reached for the last package of Blue Ridge roast at the same time as Mr. Clark here. And now he's trying to claim he has more right to it than I do. Mr. Jameson held up a hand, silencing them both. Please, let's take a step back. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Clark, this kind of disturbance is unacceptable in our store. You're disrupting other customers and creating a scene. As if to emphasize his point, a young woman near the back of the crowd called out, Hey, this is going viral. You're on TikTok. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Viral? On TikTok? She glanced at Julia, whose expression had morphed from embarrassment to horror. Mom, Julia whispered urgently, we need to go. Now. But Mr. Jameson wasn't finished. I'm going to have to ask you both to leave the store immediately. This behavior is completely unacceptable. Leave? Sarah and Robert exclaimed in unison, then glared at each other. But my groceries, Sarah started. I've been shopping here for decades, Robert protested. Mr. Jameson's expression remained unmoved. I'm sorry, but I can't have you disturbing other customers. You can return another day when you've both calmed down. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. This was her only free afternoon to do the shopping. How was she supposed to feed her family for the week? As if reading her thoughts, Julia spoke up. Mr. Jameson, please. My mom didn't mean to cause trouble. We really need to do our shopping today. The manager's expression softened slightly at Julia's plea, but he shook his head. I'm sorry, but rules are rules. You'll have to come back another time. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't leave without groceries, but how could she stay after all this? The judging eyes of the crowd, the phones recording her every move, Julia's pleading looks, it was all too much. In that moment of desperation, Sarah made a decision. Taking a deep breath, she looked Mr. Jameson in the eye. Sir, I understand we caused a disturbance. But please, let me explain why this coffee is so important to my family. Robert scoffed. Oh, here we go with the sob story, Mr. Clark, please, Mr. Jameson interrupted, then turned back to Sarah. Mrs. Thompson, I'm listening, but make it quick. Sarah nodded, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes on her, the phones still recording. She swallowed hard and began to speak, her voice shaky but determined. This coffee, it's more than just a drink for us. My husband works long hours in construction. It's backbreaking work, and some days, the only thing that gets him out of bed is the promise of this coffee. It's a small luxury, but it means the world to him. To us. She paused, fighting back tears. I know it might seem silly to argue over coffee, but when you're stretching every dollar, when you're trying to give your family just a little bit of joy, sometimes a small thing becomes everything. The aisle fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air. Even Robert's stern expression had softened slightly. Mr. Jameson looked thoughtful, clearly weighing his options. But before he could respond, a new voice rang out from the back of the crowd. I think we all need to hear both sides of this story. All eyes turned to the source of the voice. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair stepped forward. I'm Linda, and I'm a social worker, she said, her voice calm but authoritative. I think we've all jumped to conclusions here without really understanding what's going on. Mr. Clark, would you like to share your side? Robert, caught off guard by this unexpected turn, hesitated for a moment. The crowd, which had been buzzing with whispers, fell silent, waiting. Well, he began, his gruff exterior cracking slightly. As I told Mrs. Thompson, this coffee was my late wife's favorite. Margaret, she passed away 2 years ago. Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she watched Robert's face soften with memory. Every Sunday morning for 40 years, Margaret would brew a pot of Blue Ridge roast. The smell would wake me up, and I'd find her in the kitchen, humming as she made breakfast. Robert's voice wavered. Now, I brew that pot myself every Sunday. It's all I have left of our tradition. The atmosphere in the aisles shifted palpably. Sarah could see the judgment in people's eyes turning to sympathy. Linda nodded encouragingly. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Clark. It's clear this coffee holds deep meaning for you. Mrs. Thompson, you mentioned your husband. Can you tell us more about your situation? Sarah took a deep breath, feeling Julia's supportive hand on her arm. Mark, my husband, he works in construction. He leaves before dawn and comes home after dark, his body aching, covered in dirt and sweat. She paused, remembering Mark's exhausted face. This coffee, it's the one thing that brings a smile to his face every morning. It's not just about the taste, it's a reminder that even though times are tough, we can still have something special. As Sarah spoke, memories flooded her mind. She remembered the day Mark had lost his job at the factory, the fear in his eyes as he wondered how they'd make ends meet. The long nights spent poring over bills, figuring out what they could cut to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. We've had to give up so much, Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion. No more family vacations, no new clothes unless absolutely necessary, clipping coupons and buying generic brands. But this coffee, it's our one small luxury. It's a promise to ourselves that things will get better. The crowd listened in rapt attention, many nodding in understanding or wiping away tears. Robert's stern expression had completely melted away, replaced by one of compassion and a hint of shame. Mrs. Thompson, he said softly, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for assuming. Sarah shook her head. No, Mr. Clark, I'm the one who should apologize. I was so focused on my own needs that I didn't consider yours. Your loss, your memories, they're just as important. Linda smiled gently. This is what happens when we take the time to listen to each other. Now, is there a way we can find a solution that works for both of you? Before either Sarah or Robert could respond, Mr. Jameson cleared his throat. I think I might have an idea, he said, a slight smile on his face. If you'll both follow me to my office, I believe we can work something out. As they turned to follow the manager, Sarah noticed the crowd dispersing, many of them looking thoughtful. She caught snippets of conversation. Makes you think, doesn't it? Never know what someone's going through. Reminds me of when we were struggling after Dad lost his job. Maybe I should call my grandma, see if she needs anything. In Mr. Jameson's small, cluttered office, Sarah and Robert sat side by side, the contentious package of coffee on the desk between them. The manager leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. First, I want to apologize for my hasty judgment earlier, he began. Listening to both of your stories has made me realize that this situation calls for compassion, not punishment. Sarah and Robert nodded, both looking slightly embarrassed. Now, as for the coffee, Mr. Jameson continued, I've checked our inventory. We're due for a delivery tomorrow morning, which will include several packages of Blue Ridge roast. He paused, making sure he had their full attention. Here's what I propose, Mr. Clark, you take this package home today. Mrs. Thompson, if you can come by tomorrow afternoon, I'll personally set aside a package for you, free of charge. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. That's very generous of you, Mr. Jameson, but I couldn't possibly. Please, Mr. Jameson interrupted gently. Consider it our way of making amends for the distress caused today. And, he added with a small smile, a thank you for reminding us all of the importance of understanding and compassion. Robert nodded slowly. That sounds more than fair. He turned to Sarah. Mrs. Thompson, I truly am sorry for my behavior earlier. I let my emotions get the better of me. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. I'm sorry too, Mr. Clark. I should have been more considerate of your feelings. As they stood to leave, Robert hesitated, then held out the package of coffee to Sarah. Please take it. Your husband needs it more than I do right now. I can wait until tomorrow. Sarah was touched by the gesture but shook her head. That's very kind of you, but no. Your Sunday morning tradition is important. I'll come by tomorrow for our package. They shook hands, the earlier tension completely dissipated. As they walked out of the office, Sarah was surprised to see Julia waiting for her, a cart full of groceries beside her. I did the shopping while you were talking, Julia explained, a hint of pride in her voice. I got everything on your list, plus a few things on sale. Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight hug, feeling a surge of love and gratitude. Thank you, sweetie. You're amazing. As they made their way to the checkout, Sarah noticed people smiling at her, a few even giving encouraging nods. The earlier judgment had been replaced by understanding and support. Outside the store, as they loaded the groceries into their car, Sarah paused, looking back at the Greenwood supermarket. What had started as a simple shopping trip had turned into something so much more, a lesson in empathy, the power of sharing stories, and the unexpected connections that can form in the most ordinary of places. Little did Sarah know, this was just the beginning. The ripples from this incident would spread far beyond the supermarket aisles, touching lives and changing her community in ways she could never have imagined. The drive home from Greenwood supermarket was quiet, the silence punctuated only by the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional rustle of grocery bags in the back seat. Sarah's mind was still reeling from the events that had unfolded, replaying the confrontation with Mr. Clark and the unexpected resolution that followed. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, Julia finally broke the silence. Mom, she began hesitantly, why didn't you tell me things were so tough for us? Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She turned to face her daughter, seeing not just curiosity in those young eyes, but a maturity that hadn't been there before. We didn't want you to worry, sweetheart. Your dad and we've always tried to shield you kids from our financial struggles. Julia's brow furrowed. But Mom, I'm not a little kid anymore. I could have helped, you know? Like I did with the shopping today. As they got out of the car and began unloading the groceries, Sarah felt a mix of pride and regret wash over her. Her daughter was growing up, showing a level of awareness and compassion that both warmed and worried her heart. You're right, Julia, Sarah admitted as they carried the bags into the kitchen. We should have been more open with you. It's hard for parents to admit when they're struggling. Julia set her bags on the counter and turned to face her mother. I get it, Mom. But you don't have to protect me from everything. We're a family, right? We should face things together. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. She pulled Julia into a tight hug, marveling at how her little girl had grown into this thoughtful young woman. You're absolutely right, sweetie. I promise we'll be more open from now on. As they put away the groceries, Julia's phone buzzed incessantly. She glanced at it, her eyes widening. Mom, you're not going to believe this. The video of what happened at the supermarket. It's gone viral. Sarah froze, a can of soup halfway to the shelf. What do you mean, viral? Julia held up her phone, showing a TikTok video that had already garnered hundreds of thousands of views. The caption read, Coffee conflict turns into heartwarming community moment. It's not just on TikTok, Julia continued, scrolling through her phone. It's all over Twitter and Facebook too. People are sharing it like crazy. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her mind spinning. But why? It was just a silly argument over coffee. Julia sat down next to her mother, her eyes shining with excitement. No, Mom, it was so much more than that. People are calling it a perfect example of how understanding and communication can turn conflicts into connections. You and Mr. Clark, you're like accidental heroes. As Sarah scrolled through the comments, she was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and empathy. This is what happens when we take the time to listen to each other. Beautiful moment. Been there with the tough times. The coffee lady is all of us trying to keep it together. The old man's story about his wife. I'm not crying, you're crying. But it wasn't just supportive comments. People were sharing their own stories of financial struggles, of holding on to small comforts in hard times, of cherishing memories of lost loved ones. The incident had struck a chord, resonating with people in ways Sarah could never have imagined. Julia, Sarah said slowly, I think we need to do something about this. It doesn't feel right to have all this attention without using it for something good. Julia's eyes lit up. I was hoping you'd say that. I've been thinking, what if we started a community support group? You know, for families struggling like us, or seniors like Mr. Clark who might need help or just company. Sarah felt a surge of pride at her daughter's initiative. That's a wonderful idea, sweetie. But where would we even start? As if on cue, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, she answered, putting it on speaker. Hello, is this Sarah Thompson? A warm, familiar voice asked. Yes, this is she. Mrs. Thompson, this is Linda, the social worker from the supermarket earlier today. I hope you don't mind, but I got your number from Mr. Jameson. I've been seeing the videos circulating, and I had an idea I wanted to run by you. Sarah and Julia exchanged excited glances. We're all ears, Linda, Sarah replied. Well, Linda continued, I work with a local community center, and we've been looking for ways to bring people together, especially after all the isolation of the past few years. Your story and Mr. Clark's, they've really touched a lot of people. I was wondering if you'd be interested in speaking at a community event? Share your experiences, maybe inspire others to open up about their own struggles? Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Public speaking had never been her forte. But then she looked at Julia, saw the encouragement and belief shining in her eyes, and knew what she had to do. That sounds wonderful, Linda. But I have one condition. My daughter Julia needs to be involved too. She's the one who really showed me the importance of openness and understanding today. Julia's face lit up with a mix of surprise and joy. Of course, Linda agreed enthusiastically. In fact, having a youth perspective would be incredibly valuable. Shall we meet tomorrow to discuss the details? As Sarah ended the call, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. What had started as a simple trip to the supermarket was blossoming into something much bigger, something that could truly make a difference in their community. Well, Julia, Sarah said, squeezing her daughter's hand, it looks like we've got some work to do. Are you ready? Julia's determined smile was all the answer she needed. Together, mother and daughter began to plan, their kitchen table becoming the launching pad for a journey either of them could have anticipated just hours before. The community center's main hall buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, with people lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Sarah stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest as she peeked through the curtain at the growing crowd. Mom, are you okay? Julia asked, placing a reassuring hand on her mother's arm. Sarah took a deep breath, turning to face her daughter. Just a little nervous, sweetie. I've never spoken in front of so many people before. Julia smiled encouragingly. You've got this, Mom. Just speak from your heart, like you did at the supermarket. As they waited for their cue, Sarah reflected on the whirlwind of the past week. The video of the supermarket incident had continued to gain traction, sparking discussions about community, empathy, and the hidden struggles many face. Local news stations had picked up the story, interviewing both Sarah and Mr. Clark about their unexpected viral fame. Linda, true to her word, had worked tirelessly to organize this community event. Breaking Barriers, Building Bridges was its title, aimed at encouraging open dialogue about personal struggles and fostering a spirit of mutual support. Mrs. Thompson, Julia, we're ready for you, a stagehand whispered, gesturing towards the stage. Sarah squeezed Julia's hand, and together they walked out onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded them, the audience a sea of indistinct faces. As Sarah's eyes adjusted, she was stunned to see just how many people had shown up. Linda stood at the podium, her warm smile a beacon of calm. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah and Julia Thompson, whose story has touched so many of us this past week. The applause was thunderous. Sarah approached the microphone, her legs feeling like jelly. She glanced at Julia, who gave her a thumbs up, then took a deep breath and began to speak. A week ago, if you had told me I'd be standing here in front of all of you, I would have thought you were crazy, Sarah started, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each word. I was just a mom trying to buy coffee. But that day in the supermarket taught me something profound. Behind every person, every face we pass on the street, there's a story we don't know. She recounted the incident with Mr. Clark, not shying away from her own initial anger and frustration. I was so focused on my own struggles that I couldn't see his pain, his loss. And he couldn't see mine. We were two people, both hurting, both holding on to something that represented more than just a product on a shelf. As Sarah spoke, she noticed Mr. Clark in the front row, nodding encouragingly. His presence gave her strength to continue. My family has been struggling financially for years, Sarah admitted, her voice cracking slightly. We've had to make hard choices, give up so much. That coffee, it was our one small luxury, a daily reminder that things would get better. But I realized something important that day. We're not alone in our struggles. She gestured to the audience. Look around you. Every person in this room has a story, has struggles we know nothing about. The neighbor who never seems to smile? Maybe they're dealing with a loss like Mr. Clark. The cashier who seems distracted? They might be worrying about how to pay their bills, just like my family. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. But here's the beautiful thing I've learned this past week. When we open up, when we share our stories, something magical happens. We connect. We understand. We realize that we're all in this together. She turned to Julia, inviting her to the microphone. Julia stepped forward, her young face serious but her eyes bright with determination. Hi everyone, Julia began, her voice clear and confident. I'm Julia, and until last week, I had no idea how much my family was struggling. My parents tried to protect me from their worries, but you know what? Kids see more than adults think. A ripple of knowing laughter went through the audience. When I saw my mom arguing over that coffee, at first I was so embarrassed, Julia continued. But then I listened. I really listened. To my mom, to Mr. Clark, to everyone sharing their stories. And I realized something. We're all carrying weights we don't show the world. But we don't have to carry them alone. Julia's words, wise beyond her years, held the audience captive. I've started a youth group at my school, she announced proudly. We're calling it Hidden Struggles, Open Hearts. It's a safe space for kids to talk about the things they're dealing with at home, whether it's money problems, family issues, or just feeling alone. Because no one should have to face their struggles in silence. As Julia stepped back, the applause was deafening. Sarah felt a surge of pride for her daughter's courage and initiative. Returning to the microphone, Sarah concluded, what started as a moment of conflict has become a catalyst for change. Today, I'm announcing the formation of the Greenwood Community Support Network. It's a program to connect people in need with those who can help, whether it's assistance with groceries, home repairs, or just a friendly face to talk to. She smiled at Mr. Clark. And yes, there will be plenty of coffee to go around. The laughter that rippled through the crowd was warm and genuine. I stand here today not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who's learning, growing, and reaching out. I invite all of you to join us. Share your stories. Offer a helping hand. Be the change we need in our community. As Sarah finished speaking, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced Julia, overwhelmed by the response. Linda returned to the podium, her own eyes glistening. Thank you, Sarah and Julia, for your courage and honesty. Now, I'd like to invite anyone who feels moved to share their own story to come up to the microphone. What followed was nothing short of transformative. One by one, people from all walks of life approached the stage. A young man spoke about his struggles with mental health and the stigma he faced. An elderly woman shared her experiences with loneliness after losing her husband. A teenager bravely discussed his family's battles with addiction. Each story was met with empathy, understanding, and offers of support. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans to meet for coffee, and signed up for the new community support network. As the event wound down, Sarah stood at the back of the hall, watching in awe as connections formed and barriers crumbled. Julia joined her, slipping her hand into her mother's. We did it, Mom, Julia said softly. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. No, sweetie. We're just getting started. As they left the community center that evening, Sarah knew that their lives, and their community, would never be the same. What had begun as a simple trip to the supermarket had blossomed into a movement of compassion, understanding, and hope. And it was only the beginning. The weeks following the community center event were a whirlwind of activity for Sarah and Julia. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages from people wanting to get involved, share their stories, or simply express gratitude for the movement they had inadvertently started. One crisp Saturday morning, Sarah found herself sitting across from Mr. Clark at a small cafe near Greenwood Supermarket. 2 steaming cups of Blue Ridge roast sat between them, their rich aroma a reminder of how this all began. "I never thought I'd be sharing coffee with the woman I almost came to blows with over it," Mr. Clark chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Sarah smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Life has a funny way of bringing people together, doesn't it? As they sipped their coffee, the conversation flowed easily. Mr. Clark opened up about his life with Margaret, sharing stories that made Sarah laugh and, at times, blink back tears. "You know, Mr. Clark said, his voice softening, "Margaret would have loved what you and Julia are doing. She always said that a community is only as strong as the connections between its people." Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I wish I could have met her. She sounds like an amazing woman." "She was, Mr. Clark agreed, his eyes misting over. "But you know, Sarah, talking about her like this, it helps. For so long, I've kept her memory locked away, afraid that sharing it would somehow diminish it. But now I see that sharing keeps her alive in a way." As Mr. Clark spoke, Sarah felt a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying start to lift. She took a deep breath and decided to share something she'd been holding back. "Robert," she began, using his first name for the first time, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I haven't told anyone outside my immediate family." Mr. Clark leaned in, his expression open and encouraging. "The reason we've been struggling so much. It's not just the economy or bad luck," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, my husband, he's been battling depression. He lost his job at the factory 2 years ago, and it hit him hard. Really hard." The words tumbled out, carrying with them months of pent-up worry and fear. She told Mr. Clark about the days Mark couldn't get out of bed, about the medical bills piling up, about her constant fear that one day she'd come home and find that Mark had done something irreversible. "That coffee," Sarah said, her voice cracking, "it became a symbol of hope for us. On the days when Mark managed to get up and have a cup, I knew we'd make it through another day. It was something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away." Mr. Clark reached across the table, gently placing his hand over Sarah's. "Oh, my dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I had no idea. Thank you for trusting me with this." As Sarah wiped away tears, she felt a profound sense of relief. Sharing her burden, even with someone who had been a stranger just weeks ago, made it feel lighter somehow. "You know, Mr. Clark said after a moment, I've been thinking. I have some connections from my days in business. What if we could find Mark a job? Something that could help him regain his sense of purpose?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Robert, that would be... I don't even know how to thank you for offering." He waved off her thanks with a smile. "That's what community is all about, isn't it? Supporting each other through the tough times." As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. The vulnerability she had shown, and the support she had received in return, reinforced everything she had been advocating for in the community. Meanwhile, across town at Greenwood High School, Julia was experiencing her own moment of revelation. She stood in front of her Hidden Struggles, Open Hearts group, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared to share something she'd been keeping to herself. "Guys," she began, looking out at the circle of expectant faces, "I've been asking all of you to be open and honest about your struggles. But I haven't been entirely honest about mine." The room fell silent, all eyes on Julia. "I've been putting on a brave face, acting like I've got it all together," Julia continued, her voice wavering. "But the truth is, I'm scared. I'm scared for my dad, for my family. I'm scared that no matter how much we try to help others, we might not be able to fix our own problems. As Julia opened up about her father's depression, her mother's stress, and her own feelings of helplessness, she saw understanding dawn in her peers' eyes. Many nodded, some wiped away tears. I guess what I'm trying to say, Julia concluded, is that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be scared, to not have all the answers. That's why we're here, right? To support each other, no matter what. After the meeting, Julia was surrounded by her peers, all offering words of encouragement, sharing similar experiences, or simply giving her a hug. She realized that in showing her own vulnerability, she had strengthened the bonds within the group immeasurably. As Sarah and Julia reunited at home that evening, both were emotionally drained but filled with a sense of progress. They shared their experiences, marveling at how opening up had led to unexpected support and understanding. "Mom," Julia said as they sat on the couch, a shared blanket draped over their laps, "do you think we're making a difference? Really making a difference?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "I think we are, sweetie. It might not be big, dramatic changes, but every connection we make, every story we share, it's like dropping a pebble in a pond." The ripples spread out, touching more and more people. As they sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thought, they didn't realize that the biggest ripple was yet to come, one that would test their newfound community bonds and push their movement to its limits. The following week saw a flurry of activity in Greenwood. The Community Support Network, spearheaded by Sarah and Mr. Clark, had taken off beyond their wildest expectations. What had started as a simple idea born from a coffee dispute had blossomed into a full-fledged movement. One crisp morning, Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse nervously. Today was a big day, the grand opening of the Greenwood Community Center, a hub for all the initiatives that had sprung up in the wake of their viral moment. "Mom, you look great," Julia said, popping her head into the bedroom. "Stop fussing. We're going to be late." Sarah smiled at her daughter's reflection in the mirror. I know. I just want everything to be perfect." As they drove to the community center, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. The streets of Greenwood seemed different somehow, neighbors waving to each other, people stopping to chat on corners, a general air of warmth and connection that hadn't been there before. The community center was housed in an old, refurbished warehouse. As Sarah and Julia pulled into the parking lot, they saw a crowd already gathering. Mr. Clark was there, greeting people with a wide smile. Linda, the social worker who had been instrumental in getting everything off the ground, was directing volunteers. "Mrs. Thompson." "Julia," a voice called out. They turned to see Mr. Jameson, the supermarket manager, approaching with a large box in his arms. "I brought some supplies for the coffee station. Couldn't let you run out on your big day, could we?" Sarah laughed, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Mr. Jameson, you're a lifesaver. Thank you so much." As they made their way inside, Sarah was overwhelmed by the transformation. What had once been an empty, echoing space was now filled with life. There was a bustling food bank in one corner, a job search assistance center in another. A group of seniors were setting up for their weekly coffee meetup, while a cluster of teenagers, part of Julia's Hidden Struggles, Open Hearts group, were preparing for a peer support session. "Sarah, Julia! Over here!" Linda called, waving them over to the small stage set up at the front of the main room. "We're almost ready to start. Are you prepared for your speech?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a flutter of nerves in her stomach. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." Julia squeezed her hand. "You've got this, Mom. Just speak from the heart, like always." As the clock struck 10, Linda stepped up to the microphone. The buzz of conversation died down as everyone turned their attention to the stage. "Good morning, everyone," Linda began, her voice warm and welcoming. "Thank you all for coming to the grand opening of the Greenwood Community Center. A few months ago, this was just a dream. Today, it's a reality, thanks to the hard work and dedication of so many people in this room." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But there are two people in particular who sparked this movement. Their story reminded us of the power of empathy, understanding, and community. Please welcome Sarah and Julia Thompson. The applause was thunderous as Sarah and Julia made their way to the stage. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly as she approached the microphone, but as she looked out at the sea of friendly faces, she felt a calm settle over her. "Thank you all for being here today," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "When Julia and I walked into Greenwood Supermarket that day, we had no idea our lives were about to change. We certainly had no idea we'd be standing here, in front of all of you, opening a community center." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "But that's the funny thing about life, isn't it? Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. A reach for a package of coffee. A willingness to listen to someone else's story. A decision to open up about our own struggles." Sarah went on to talk about the journey of the past few months, the challenges they'd faced, the bonds they'd formed, the lives they'd touched. She spoke about the food drives they'd organized, the job fairs, the support groups. With each example, she could see heads nodding, smiles spreading. "But this center," Sarah continued, gesturing around her, "is more than just a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. It's a promise that no one in our community needs to face their struggles alone." She turned to Julia, inviting her to speak. Julia stepped forward, her young face beaming with pride and purpose. "When my mom and I started this journey," Julia said, her voice clear and confident, "we had no idea where it would lead. But what we've discovered is that every single person has the power to make a difference. Whether it's offering a listening ear, sharing a skill, or simply showing up to support your neighbors, every action counts." As Julia spoke about the youth initiatives she'd spearheaded, Sarah felt a swell of pride. Her daughter had grown so much in these past months, finding her voice and her passion. Together, Sarah and Julia concluded their speech, "This center belongs to all of us. It's a place to find help, to offer help, and to remind ourselves that we're all in this together. Welcome to your Greenwood Community Center." The applause was deafening as Sarah and Julia embraced, tears of joy streaming down their faces. As they stepped off the stage, they were engulfed by hugs, handshakes, and words of gratitude. Mr. Clark made his way through the crowd, his eyes misty. "Margaret would have loved this," he said, pulling Sarah and Julia into a hug. "You've done something truly special here." As the day progressed, Sarah watched in awe as the community center came to life. People of all ages and backgrounds mingled, sharing stories, offering support, and making connections. In every corner, she could see the ripple effects of that fateful day in the supermarket. What had started as a simple trip for coffee had transformed not just their lives, but an entire community. And as Sarah looked around at the vibrant, bustling center, she knew that this was just the beginning. The story of Greenwood was still being written, one connection at a time. As the sun began to set on the day of the Greenwood Community Center's grand opening, Sarah found herself sitting on a bench outside, taking a moment to catch her breath. The day had been a whirlwind of activity, emotions, and connections. She closed her eyes, letting the warm evening breeze wash over her, carrying with it the sounds of laughter and conversation from inside. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. Sarah opened her eyes to see Mr. Jameson, the supermarket manager, standing before her with 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. She smiled and patted the space next to her. "I thought you might need this, Mr. Jameson said, offering her one of the cups. "Blue Ridge roast, of course." Sarah took the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Thank you, Mr. Jameson, for everything." He sat down beside her, his own cup cradled in his hands. "You know, Mrs. Thompson, I've been in retail for over 30 years. I thought I'd seen it all. But what you and your daughter have accomplished, it's truly remarkable." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, savoring the flavor that had come to mean so much more than just a morning pick-me-up. "We couldn't have done it without you, you know. Your kindness that day in the supermarket, it was the spark that started all of this." Mr. Jameson chuckled softly. "I was just doing my job." You and Julia, you're the ones who took that spark and turned it into a blazing fire of community spirit. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as people continued to stream in and out of the community center. Each person who exited seemed to carry with them a renewed sense of purpose and connection. You know, Mr. Jameson said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about how we can keep this momentum going. The supermarket, we have resources that could really help support what you're doing here. Sarah turned to him, intrigued. What did you have in mind? Well, for starters, we could set up a permanent donation bin for the food bank. And maybe a bulletin board for community announcements and job postings. Oh, and we could do a weekly community special where a portion of the proceeds from a featured product goes to support the center's initiatives. Sarah's eyes widened with each suggestion. Mr. Jameson, that would be incredible. Are you sure the corporate office would approve? He grinned, a twinkle in his eye. Let's just say I've been inspired to be a bit more proactive in my managerial decisions. Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, especially when it's for a good cause. Just then, Julia burst out of the center, her face flushed with excitement. Mom! Mr. Jameson! You've got to come see this. They followed her inside, where a crowd had gathered around a large whiteboard. People were writing feverishly, filling the board with ideas, commitments, and promises. We started brainstorming about future initiatives, Julia explained breathlessly. And it just exploded. Sarah scanned the board, her heart swelling with each entry she read. Weekly Seniors Tech Support Workshop, Monthly Community Potluck Dinner, After School Tutoring Program, Job Skills Training Seminars, Mental Health Awareness Campaign, and there, right in the center, written in Mr. Clark's neat handwriting, Sunday Morning Coffee Club, all are welcome. It's amazing, isn't it? Mr. Clark said, appearing at Sarah's side. To think, all of this grew from a simple misunderstanding over coffee. Sarah nodded, feeling overwhelmed by the outpouring of community spirit. I never could have imagined this when I walked into the supermarket that day. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing on the small stage once more, this time with Julia, Mr. Clark, Linda, and Mr. Jameson by her side. The room quieted as she cleared her throat to speak. Before we close for the night, Sarah began, her voice filled with emotion. I want to thank each and every one of you. What we've accomplished here today isn't just the opening of a building. It's the beginning of a new chapter for Greenwood. She gestured to the whiteboard full of ideas. Looking at all of your suggestions and commitments, I'm filled with hope for our future. But I also want to make a promise to all of you. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. I promise that this center will always be a place of acceptance, support, and community. No matter who you are, where you come from, or what struggles you face, you will find open arms and open hearts here. Julia stepped forward, her young face serious. And I promise that we'll keep listening to your stories, your ideas, and your needs. This center belongs to all of us, and it will grow and change as we do. Mr. Clark raised his coffee cup in a toast. To new beginnings, new friendships, and the power of community. The room erupted in cheers and applause. As people began to file out, many stopped to shake hands, exchange hugs, or share one last idea for the future. Later that night, as Sarah and Julia walked to their car, the parking lot now nearly empty, they paused to look back at the building. The lights inside were dim, but the promise of what it represented shone brightly. Mom, Julia said softly, do you think we really made a difference? Sarah put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. Sweetie, I think we've only just begun to see the difference we can make. But yes, I believe with all my heart that we've started something truly special here. As they drove home, the streets of Greenwood seemed different somehow. Warmer, more alive with possibility. Sarah knew that challenges lay ahead. Sustaining this level of community engagement wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But as she glanced at Julia, saw the determination and hope shining in her daughter's eyes, Sarah felt ready to face whatever came next. They had turned a moment of conflict into a movement of compassion. And in doing so, they had not just changed their own lives, but had given an entire community the chance to rewrite its story. The Greenwood Community Center stood as a testament to what could happen when people chose understanding over judgment, connection over isolation. It was more than just a building, it was a promise. A promise of support, of acceptance, and of the extraordinary things that could happen when ordinary people came together. As Sarah pulled into their driveway, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But for now, she allowed herself to bask in the glow of what they had achieved. One cup of coffee at a time, they were changing the world. 6 months had passed since the grand opening of the Greenwood Community Center, and the crisp autumn air had given way to the first hints of spring. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, cradling her morning cup of Blue Ridge roast, watching as the early morning light painted the neighborhood in soft, hopeful hues. The aroma of coffee filled the kitchen, a scent that now carried with it not just the promise of a new day, but the memory of how a simple dispute had transformed an entire community. Sarah smiled to herself, thinking about how far they had come. A sleepy-eyed Mark shuffled into the kitchen, wrapping his arms around Sarah from behind. "Morning, Han," he murmured, resting his chin on her shoulder. Sarah leaned back into his embrace, savoring the moment. The past months hadn't been easy, but with the support of the community, and the new sense of purpose they'd found, Mark's depression had begun to lift. The job Mr. Clark had helped secure for him at a local construction firm had been a turning point. "Big day today," Mark said, reaching for his own coffee mug. "You ready?" Sarah nodded, a mix of excitement and nerves fluttering in her stomach. Today marked the 6-month anniversary of the community center, and they had planned a special event to celebrate and reflect on their journey. As they drove to the center, Sarah marveled at the changes in Greenwood. The streets seemed more alive somehow, with people greeting each other warmly as they went about their morning routines. The supermarket, true to Mr. Jameson's word, now sported a prominent community board and a donation bin that was always overflowing with generosity. Pulling into the community center's parking lot, Sarah was struck by how different everything looked from that first grand opening day. The once bare grounds were now adorned with a flourishing community garden, its beds bursting with early spring vegetables and flowers. A colorful mural, a project led by Julia and her youth group, adorned one wall of the building, depicting hands of all colors joined together. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. The Job Search Assistance Corner was busy as always, with volunteers helping community members polish resumes and prepare for interviews. The weekly Seniors Tech Support Workshop was in full swing, filled with laughter as younger members patiently guided their elders through the mysteries of smartphones and social media. "Mom! Dad!" Julia called out, waving from across the room where she was setting up chairs for the day's event. "You're just in time. Mr. Clark was looking for you." They found Mr. Clark in the center's small kitchen, supervising the preparation of refreshments for the celebration. His face lit up as he saw them approach. "Ah, there you are," he exclaimed, pulling them both into a warm hug. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten your own anniversary party." Sarah laughed, the last of her nerves melting away in the warmth of his embrace. "As if you'd let us forget, Robert. How are the preparations coming along?" "Splendidly, Mr. Clark replied with a wink. "Wait until you see what the Sunday Morning Coffee Club has whipped up. I think we've found a few baking prodigies in our midst." As the hour of the celebration approached, people began streaming into the center. Sarah's heart swelled as she saw familiar faces, neighbors who had once been strangers, now greeting each other like old friends. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had found a job through the center's programs and was now volunteering her time to help others. And there was young Tommy, whose grades had improved dramatically thanks to the after-school tutoring program. Linda, the social worker who had been with them from the beginning, took the stage to kick off the event. 6 months ago, she began, her voice filled with emotion, we opened these doors with hope in our hearts and a vision of what our community could be. Today, we gather to celebrate not just what we've built, but the connections we've forged and the lives we've touched. As Linda spoke about the center's achievements, the jobs found, the support given, the friendships formed, Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She thought back to that day in the supermarket, how close she had come to letting anger and frustration get the better of her. How different things might have been if she hadn't taken that moment to listen, to understand. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces before her. 6 months ago, I stood on this stage and made a promise, she began. A promise that this center would always be a place of acceptance, support, and community. Today, I stand here in awe of how you all have not just embraced that promise, but expanded it beyond our wildest dreams. She went on to share stories of the impact the center had made: the single mother who had found childcare and a job, the lonely widower who had discovered a new family in the Sunday Coffee Club, the troubled teen who had found purpose in the youth mentorship program. But our work is far from over, Sarah continued, her voice strong and clear. As we celebrate our achievements, let us also look to the future. What more can we do? How can we reach those in our community who are still struggling, still feeling alone? The room buzzed with energy as people began to call out ideas, each one building on the last. Sarah smiled, remembering that first brainstorming session 6 months ago. The spirit of collaboration and community that had been born that day was still going strong. As the formal part of the celebration wound down and people began to mingle, enjoying refreshments and sharing stories, Sarah found a quiet moment with Julia and Mark. "I'm so proud of you both," Mark said, pulling them into a group hug. "You've changed so many lives, including ours." Julia beamed, her eyes shining with pride and purpose. "We all did it together, Dad. That's what community is all about." Sarah looked around the room, at the laughter and joy on every face, at the connections being forged and strengthened. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a moment of conflict to a movement of compassion. "You know," she said softly, "I think this is just the beginning. We've laid the foundation, but there's so much more we can do, so many more lives we can touch." As they stood there, surrounded by the warmth of their community, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude and hope. What had started as a simple trip for coffee had become something so much bigger, so much more meaningful. The Greenwood Community Center stood as a testament to the power of understanding, of listening, of coming together. It was a promise kept, a vision realized, and a beacon of hope for the future. And as Sarah raised her cup of Blue Ridge roast in a silent toast, she knew that the best was yet to come. One cup of coffee at a time, they were indeed changing the world.
If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next stories that will be posted soon. Thanks for watching, folks. See you on the next video.